What's the most inappropriate thing you've witnessed at a funeral? A relative of my husband died. There was a gathering at her house after the funeral, hosted by her husband. It was mostly family of my husband, but there were a few friends. There was catered food and drink and people were just general socializing and telling nice stories about the deceased. About 2 hours in, a man and woman in their mid-20s show up. They are acquaintances of the widower. They walk around the house a bit, grab a drink and then disappear. I was asked to get some more drinks from the garage, which was off the kitchen. I opened the door and stepped into the garage. There was the young couple, leaning against a car and engaging in some pretty vigorous sexual relations. Another family member who was standing in the kitchen saw what I saw. I backed out of the garage because I was fairly embarrassed. I mean, who does that at a funeral? I guess the other relative told the widower, because the next thing I know there is shouting from the garage and the widower is telling these two people in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave. Apparently, not only were they having sex in the garage, but they were doing lines of coke off the hood of the car. Only a few people who were at the gathering found out what happened. Thank goodness. Whoa fuck. My time to shine. Former mortuary industry worker. The worst is hard to call, because I've seen a lot. Some honorable mentions. A rando walking on off the street, and proceeding to help herself to coffee, and dodding in our bathroom. Didn't die. Did get narcaned. A couple fooling around in the urn/casket showroom during the viewing. An angry old woman storming out of the bathroom with a fistful of tampons, screaming about how inappropriate we were for keeping them in there, because there are children here. She threw them at the funeral director's face. They were kept in a cabinet, in a small basket, well hidden from public view. She was definitely rifling around to have found them. We were no longer allowed to keep our sanitary products in the restrooms after this. A grief-stricken mother tipping her son's casket while wailing and trying to climb inside. Less inappropriate than it was terribly sad. Caught a junkie relative digging deep into the pockets of the deceased looking for the family and as assumed money. A woman pulling down her child's pants and letting it cheat in a potted plant. The funeral homeowner's horrible dog sashaying up to the front and taking a giant liquid sheet in front of the casket and horrified guests in the middle of the service. The same dog biting someone at another service. Tons of brawls. Lots of drinking. Biker funerals were insane. The women were meaner than hell and fighting one another constantly. The dudes were awesome though. Super respectful. Cleaned the place up perfectly and even hauled their trash away. Most of which was bags of beer cans and liquor bottles. I loved biker funerals. I have some, so many, but I'll stop here. My cousin's funeral. He was 27 years old and killed in a single car crash after he hit a slippery patch on the road and smashed into a concrete wall. At his funeral, all of his brothers, sisters, and parents sat on the front row at his graveside service. Then, lo and behold, my cousin's ex-girlfriend of over a year shows up and immediately inserts herself onto the front row next to his sisters. And proceeds to scream, cry, scream, wail, and throw herself on the ground periodically throughout the service. All of the family just gave her awkward stares, with no one wanted to address her inappropriate behavior. I had never seen that type of attention-demanding drama queen antics before, or since. Edit. Just wanted to throw this in. This was a funeral with military honors, Air Force, and they did the gun salute at the Gravesit. I don't remember how many times they fire, but at each gunshot, she would literally shriek and collapse into the arms of either of the sisters standing next to her. I do recall at the very end, the youngest sister was sick of that sheet and just let her fall on the ground. And it was raining heavily and rather muddy. Only somewhat inappropriate, but certainly the funniest thing. It was a funeral for an uncle I was very distantly related to, and this is happening in Greece, in the summer. The church is very full and incredibly hot. You can smell the sweat. There's incense. The air isn't circulating, and the priest is just going on and on. I don't think I can describe how grim the situation was. Not totally unexpectedly therefore, just as the priest is getting to something particularly emotional, a man, an old colleague standing near the back, faints. He's completely out. Now, this guy was very tall and rather broad, so not only was it a miracle that he didn't take out the two tiny old ladies right in front of him, he was also really difficult to carry outside to get some air. Somebody has the brilliant idea that the palperers, those people who carry the casket, should carry him, since they've practiced it, and are reasonably strong. So everybody squeezes a bit tighter. Nobody wants to leave the church. Things just got interesting. To let them through, they picked him up. 3 on one side and 3 on the other, that is more or less as they would the casket, and start carrying him towards the door. Suddenly, this guy wakes up, turns his head several times, grasps what's going on, and who's carrying him faster than anybody can respond, and immediately starts yelling, "I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive!" At which point, one of the palperers laughs so hard that he drops what was thankfully a leg, and the others struggle to put him down in what is now a church, absolutely exploding with laughter. The whole situation went on for a good 15 minutes, in which this guy walked outside and the priest tried to resume the service, but there absolutely continued to be giggles throughout. I, being a teenager at the time, also couldn't possibly hold it back every time I thought of this guy yelling he's alive. Nobody was even particularly upset, because the uncle we were burying was always laughing and joking around, so it somehow felt appropriate that we had a great laugh at his funeral. Edit. My first award. Thanks so much, glad to put some laughter into this thread. Picture, if you will, 2 elderly women in a funeral squaring up as people are still crying from the ceremony. At the lunch after my grandpa's funeral, his daughter from a previous marriage, D, who no one had seen in years, showed up. D had been writing bad checks all the way to the state prison and had definitely had some unresolved beef with my family when she got out. The last time my mom saw her was when was 11, and D left her infant daughter for my mom to babysit and never came back. Fast forward to the funeral. D is acting like it's a family reunion, but no one is having it, since she's basically screwed everyone in the room in one way or another. My grandpa's last girlfriend, a legally blind woman, tried to physically fight her until others stepped in. Edit. Gave my crazy half-aunt a pseudonym for clarity. Edit 2. The baby left with my mom at age 11 was not me, but that would be an amazing plot twist. D had said she was just having a night out and actually decided to run off to San Francisco. This was the early 70s, and left her baby. When D didn't come back, my mom called her mom, got a hold of a relative that took care of the baby until D could be reached. Sorry, I don't have a lot of details after that, but the baby grew up, and she actually arrived at the funeral with D, and I hear the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Edit 3. I had forgotten this part somehow. After the funeral, D tried to steal the car will to grandpa's blind boo, but my family thought ahead, and a couple of my uncles waited around the house until D came for the car. They came outside and apparently she was scared off. Blind boo got the car in the end and wrecked it immediately. I can't make this shit up. Not sure if this counts as inappropriate, but when my high school classmate died, we were already in college. Ike, his ex, also high school classmate, came to the funeral. She cried so dramatically because she wasn't able to end things with our dead HS classmate on a good note that guests thought she was the current so/GF that time. Current so/GF was left alone, sitting alone staring blankly at the casket while relatives/friends/HS classmates comfort the ex. Also, it got to the point that the boyfriend can't recall if he attended or just got word of what happened of that girl during that time, got jealous and got angry because it looked like she cared more for the dead than him. Posted around on social media. Edit. Fixed pronouns since I'm bad constructing TLDR. During my college years, high school classmate died. His ex came to the funeral and cried dramatically, looking like she's the girlfriend, and current girlfriend was ignored during her sobbing. Boyfriend of the ex that time was furious. My grandmother spent the last decade and a half of her life in a nursing home with severe Alzheimer's and depression, after being kicked out of 2 other places previously for trying to kill herself. Her last years were of weary terror, not remembering her children that would visit when they could and would ask only where her mother was, and breaking down in tears when she inevitably realized what was going on, as little as she could. She lived mostly as a result of modern pharmacology and medical science with little to no quality of life. Before she passed, she'd agreed to have a priest from the church she grew up in come in and say a few words. Keep in mind this arrangement was made nearly 15 years before she passed. On the day of her funeral, the big news story was the court battle over Terry Shavo and the right of family to keep her on life support versus her husband's wishes desires to remove her from it. For those that don't remember, the church got involved and made a major thing about how taking her off life support was akin to murder. Feeling the need to opine, the priest, who had never met her and knew nothing about her, took the cue and spent 10 minutes talking about how life support is part of God's plan and removing people from it is murder, and that the concept of euthanasia was legalizing genocide. He talked about how the Nazis' extermination of the Jews was like what was going on in Florida, and how if God saw fit to grant us life, then it's our obligation to accept it as a gift, no matter the circumstances. The room was a level of deafening silence as no one could believe what words had just been spoken, what concepts had been advocated, what disconnect from the situation had been demonstrated. A man of the cloth was supposed to be there to comfort us in a time of distress and had, instead, insisted that the decades of pain and suffering of this poor woman were righteous in God's will, and how dare anyone should question whether mercy should have been granted to her. Never have I had to restrain myself more from getting up and physically removing someone from a room. When he was done, I stood up ready to go after him and felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "Let me handle this," was all he said, and walked up to the priest and lead him out. All I remember is hearing the priest say something to the effect of, "Is there a problem? There's still more I'm supposed to do," as he was being almost lifted off the floor by his arm and escorted out a door as my mom wept. The only thing I could think of was that she was denied the ability to have any dignity in her death and was now being deprived it even after her passing. A short while later, her casket was lowered into the ground next to her husband, who had passed 30 years before her. It was done without incident and without the priest. A few years ago, when we were 15, a friend of mine committed suicide. She'd been sexually assaulted and raped by her mother's partner as a child, and the mother stayed with the guy, so my friend and her younger sister ended up in foster care. The funeral was faking horrendous, with the obvious rift between her biological family and foster family. I know where I stand on the matter, and the funeral celebrant seemed to be trying to bridge the gap for the sake of respect for my friend, but he kind of came across like he was way out of his depth and didn't really know what was happening. The whole thing was overly religious considering the sort of person my friend was, and I know she would have preferred to have her actual self celebrated / mourned for, rather than the whole thing being made about, "Oh, but we lost our daughter, not you, you're the bad ones, we're the family. She deserved so much better in life and in death. I still mourn for that girl and the life she led." My partner's stepmom's funeral. I was standing next to my partner to support him when one of his distant relatives, before even giving condolences or a greeting or anything else, asked, "Are you two married?" "No." "Oh, but you're together?" "Yes." "What a shame." The same woman then approached us at the wake and started going on about how nice it was to see young love blossom after a family breakup, and how exotic I was. I'm Asian, he's white, because my partner had broken up with the mother of his child. She heavily implied that I was just a rebound and that he would be back to his normal self soon. When my partner corrected her and told her that we had been together for 5 years, she visibly became uncomfortable and said, "Oh, how nice." At my grandmother's funeral, she only had 3 blood relations left in the world, myself included. Her second husband's family did not allow any of us to be part of the planning. They wouldn't let us sit in the family pew and wouldn't let us give farewell words during the service. A family friend kicked other people out of a pew near the front at least. I nearly lost my sheet during the eulogy when the pastor stated she enjoyed plunking on the piano, the same piano she never touched, and threatened to take an axe to on a near daily basis due to all the damn dust it collected. At the grave, each of the blood relations laid a rose on the casket, and multiple people attending said, "Who are they and why are they even here?" Almost as an afterthought, we were invited to my grandmother's home after the burial, which caused many puzzled looks from attendees as to why we would be invited. I noped the hell out of that to give the woman the send-off she would have actually wanted, with alcohol and friends. My uncle's funeral. He was a state trooper who died in the line of duty, so his funeral was a big event with hundreds of people including the governor. My mom's childhood friend who has Asperger's showed up with her small yappy dog and a big DSLR. She walked up to the front to sit with the family, put her dog on the chair, and then walked around taking photos of people who were crying, getting into their faces, to frame the perfect shot, lens shutter clacking loudly, while her dog was sat on a chair yapping at everyone walking by. My uncle's widow and children approached the casket and broke into sobs. It was heart-wrenching. My mom's friend ran over and put the lens in their faces, clacking off a rapid succession of photos. Everyone there was looking around at each other like, WTF is she doing, while simultaneously crying. It was so awkward and no one had the courage to tell her to stop. Afterward, we went to a reception room for family only, guarded by police. She tried to get in saying that she was family, but they blocked her until she got the attention of my mom, who told them to let her in. Then the governor arrived to offer his respects. He was quietly comforting my grandmother in a tender moment when my mom's friend butted in and loudly introduced herself as my uncle's sister. Then she started in on an embarrassing story about my uncle running around the neighborhood in his underwear in high school. She was getting so close to the governor and so aggressively animated in her storytelling that his security had to step in and block her. Then the governor apologized, said he needed to go, and quickly left. My father's funeral. After the service and the reception after, my mother, brother, and sister headed back to our family home. A bunch of my father's siblings and their family were also staying at the house with us. We got home a few minutes before everyone else. I was sitting at a table in the living room when I could see their cars come down the driveway. They all got out and were hugging and seemingly congratulating each other. The reception after the service was beautifully put together and was actually a fun time. A fitting send-off for my father. So I assumed they were still just having fun from that until they came inside. They all came in together very quickly and quietly. They came up to me and my older brother sitting at the table and kind of crowded around like a bunch of kids about to see if they could have a cookie before dinner. My Aunt Barbara smugly stood at the front and asked, "So when are we going to be doing the reading of the will to see what was left to us all?" My brother and I just looked at each other for a few moments before we turned to them to say, "Are you kidding? Reading of the will? Like a soap opera. There is no reading of the will. Everything that belonged to my father now just belongs to my mother." The look of defeat, but not shame, was disgustingly transparent. They were supposed to stay another few nights. They packed up and left that afternoon. Edit. I made up my name on the spot, not my comments. You can take the 2 seconds to click on it and see for yourself. My grandfather's brother's funeral kicked off the great tombstone debacle of 2009. My grandfather's brother, Sergey, was a hoser who never kept a steady job and drank a lot. He was also known for playing the banjo and supporting the Saskatchewan Raiders. After Sergey died, my grandfather and another of their brothers, Valery, somehow ended up designing his tombstone. It has his name, a little picture of him, his date of birth and death, and a giant banjo with the Saskatchewan Raiders logo on it. Sergey's wife and kids did not approve of the banjo tombstone. No one else in the family liked it either. Once it came out that my grandfather and Valery were responsible for this abomination, the non-tombstone approving family members ganged up on them, and it ended with a fist fight in the cemetery parking lot. Since then, the rest of the family has tried to remove the banjo tombstone. As far as I'm concerned, it's still there, and Sergio's wife is still mad at my grandfather and Valery. Since my grandfather died, she's now taking her beef out on my grandmother, which is now playing out on Facebook. She also refused to attend Valery's wife's funeral. At my grandfather-in-law's funeral, my husband's mother is a saint, and I would gladly cut a beach for her. I don't know where she got her sweetness from, because it was clearly not from husband's grandmother, her mom. Her mother ditched all the kids with dad when they were babies, literally left them in his driveway and disappeared. Over the years my mother-in-law talks to her maybe once a year. So her dad dies, the only parent who raised her, and the only parent that showed her love. Her evil beach of a mother had the balls to show up to the funeral to bask in the attention, and the first and only thing she says to my mill was, "I need the death certificate so I can file for whatever benefits or retirement money he had," even though they had been divorced for 40 some odd years and she had already remarried. My mill was already in tears, and to say that to the daughter you abandoned while she was grieving, horrible. My husband had to physically restrain me because I wanted to knock her on her dusty ass. My family is always a trashy dumpster fire, but I guess every family has a few stray trash bags somewhere. Not at the funeral, but fresh enough in my memory and incredibly inappropriate. My parents divorced when I was a toddler. Because of my mom's drug use, my dad got custody of us, but he didn't really know what he was doing as a single father to two young girls. So, my dad's parents are really who raised us. My grandpa gave what should have been his years of relaxation to do everything for my sister and me. In the end, his hard work for us is probably why he left us so soon. I live 1,000 miles from my family 12 hours after the man that raised me passed away. I hopped on a plane and flew home. I was greeted there by my sister, her fiancé, my brother, my mom's son, and my mother. Higher than high. I never felt more angry or disgusted in my entire life. My grandmother's funeral. My entire family is gathered after the service and before the burial. As we are leaving for the cemetery, my sister wisely says we should leave our phones as well so there is no disturbance during the burial ceremony. We all agree, but I'm told to keep mine with me as there is a babysitter looking after all the really young kids and they should have a way to get in contact with us in case of emergency. Sounds good. Phone is on vibrate. If worst case happens, won't be that bad. Fast forward to the burial. Very somber, very nice service for a wonderful lady, and my cousins and I are now lowering our beloved grandmother into her eternal resting place when my ex decides to call asking for my Netflix password. Her custom ringtone of the chorus, "To Run to the Hills" by Iron Maiden, goes off as loud as my poor Nokia could muster. This, as well as the fact that it was in my inner suit jacket pocket, defended by two buttons with my wool coat as the final layer, to ensure my lasting embarrassment. Oh, and my hands were occupied lowering dear Granny Marge halfway down a dirt hole. The ringtone repeated 3 times before she hit bottom and I could get a hand in to silence it. As I moved away from her plot and took my place with my family, my brother-in-law leaned towards me and whispered that was faking awesome. At my father's funeral, at 20 years old, a friend of a friend attended and proceeded to use the event as a way of ingratiating himself and desperately trying to get a friend, something I can presume was difficult for him. During the receiving line, an already awful process, where the family of the deceased line up to have everyone awkwardly say something to them, he stepped to my side and proceeded to have a side conversation with me, while friends and coworkers of my father said things to me. In this totally inappropriate side conversation where others had to wait for him to finish, or where he occasionally interjected with "how nice" and such, he said, "Hey, I've got a soccer game later today, you should come and watch." Sad really. But, yeah, totally faking inappropriate. There is one day a life when I don't want to be the kind of person who feels sorry for this poor dude, and that's at my father's funeral. Happened last month at my grandma's funeral. I knew my elusive BO dad would be there with his crazy foreign wife. They have been together for 10+ years, and within that time, she's managed to totally isolate him from his entire family, including me. He left my mom when I was 1, so it's nothing new, but this is different. He's not allowed to call me, and emails me occasionally on a private line. In fact, the last time I saw him was at my cousin's funeral 5 years ago. Anyway, everyone was obviously here to celebrate the life of my wonderful grandma. My father asked if I wanted to ride with them from the service to the cemetery, and I obliged. The entire time, she wouldn't stop talking because she didn't want us to have a conversation. The pinnacle of her convo was that she was going to get buried in a national military cemetery because of my father's high ranking. Okay then. I just smiled and nodded. We get back from the cemetery to the church for a luncheon with everyone in attendance. My father leaves the table for one moment to go to the bathroom, leaving us alone. She immediately turns to me and says, "You look different. You've gained a lot of weight. Are you pregnant?" Honestly, I've gained maybe 10 pounds since I've seen them 5 years ago, but I'm incredibly active and not overweight. Taken aback, I said, "Excuse me?" She then looked at me in the eye and slowly said, "Are you pregnant?" I was so sad and I told her that was rude and excused myself. I went to sit next to my aunt and cousins and broke down. My father came back, and she stormed up to him and started spewing and practically foaming at the mouth, guaranteed making up lies about me as she has done in the past. I saw him look down, then go around the room and said goodbye to everyone. Then he left. The whole family was undoubtedly pissed. He has 7 brothers and 3 sisters. We are a large French Catholic family that is very close, and he literally just left. I'm in my late 20s and have come to terms with losing my father, but I'm not going to lie, she cut into me and it worked. God, I hate that beach. My cousin Odd, don't do heroin y'all, it fucks your family up good when you die. The funeral was a shit show. My cousin's girlfriend chopped off a chunk of her hair and sprinkled it on his body. Not like, cut off a lock and tie it in a bow. He looked like someone had let a cat all over his corpse, faking blonde hair everywhere. So then the speeches start. His stepfather gets up and starts preaching about how we have to talk to our kids about drugs, etc etc. We are at a funeral for an overdose buddy. It's a little late. Anyway, his 10-year-old daughter, the sister of the dead guy, is sitting in the front row. He starts talking about how the darkness overcame my cousin and how he had talked to his daughter about how he made her promise to never let the darkness get her. He says, "Girl's name, promise me you'll never let the darkness get you." She meekly mumbles, "I promise," and he screams at her louder, so she says it a little louder. I was horrified for her. Then he said that the slogan of his new anti-drug campaign is to wait is too late, and now my brother and I use that for anything and everything because it's hands down the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. TLDR, to wait is too late. Don't do heroin. At the funeral of her young daughter, my friend's mom had her even younger daughter come up to me and ask if I would name the child I was pregnant with after her. Maybe this isn't that inappropriate, but it made me feel really put on the spot and heart-wrenchingly uncomfortable to have to explain to an 8-year-old why I couldn't name my baby after her suddenly gone big sister. The mother also took me aside to ask if her baby died a virgin. In mom's defense, I think she was more than appropriately sedated to deal with the loss of her 15-year-old. I hold nothing at all against her and understand she was mad with grief. It was just some stuff that made me feel uncomfortable in the moment. After said funeral and all memorials dedicated to the friend who was killed by a drunk driver, our group of friends kept going out to get plastered drunk to celebrate her life. Frankly, it was frigging disgusting and completely spit in the face of anything they should have learned from her untimely death. I was livid. I had a guy I grew up with use the funeral of a different childhood friend as an easy gathering place to carry out one of his 12 steps and get me, and for all I know some others, to forgive him for stuff. At my grandmother's funeral, my mom got up to speak and talked about what a horrible relationship they had and basically how bad of a mother she was to her. I had to repeatedly motion for her to stop and walk away from the podium. It was that bad. Memorial service was for a 1-month-old infant. The father's family asked for their minister to run the service, even though neither parent was religious, as whole minister proceeds to go on for 20 minutes about how his wife once thought she was pregnant, but ended up not being so. So he knows what it is like to lose a child. I was about to interrupt him to cut him off when he finally finished. We get to the cemetery. He steps out of his car with a Jesus Saves bowl cap on. I saw Ed. Who the fuck wears a bowl cap to a funeral? He was to give the graveside service. I walk up next to him, get his attention, and say, "Take that faking bull cap off your head. Show some faking respect." On second thought, I will be doing the graveside. We don't need you. He chuckled and reluctantly took off the hat. I'm not sure if he even stuck around at whole. My friend died suddenly in his mid-30s. He had been estranged from his parents for over 15 years at that point, as they were staunchly Christian and would not abide having a son who wasn't religious. As he was young and not wealthy, he had no will or funeral arrangements made, but had told us, including his best friend, who housed him and got him a job for most of those 15 years, that he wouldn't want a church funeral and thought cremation was dope. His parents made his funeral entirely religious, lied in the a bit that he was reformed, and came back to the church before his death, and had him buried on the church plot under a cross. There was not a single photo or reference of his adult life at the wake or funeral, and his best friend was not allowed to attend either as, they claimed, she was the harlot who caused him to stray from the Lord. I managed to get in purely because they didn't know who I was. At the end of the funeral, his mother called for those in attendance to reject those who caused him to abandon his faith and singled best friend out, telling the whole congregation that there'd be a special place in hell for her and her family. They sold everything they could that was in his apartment and threw out the rest. Any photos or memories of him and best friend were trashed. Fuck them so faking hard. Oh gosh, I'm late to this thread, but here's a doozy. This needs some backstory first. My cousin got married in his early 20s to a great girl. They were in love and had a dog together. Looked like a bright and happy future ahead. Suddenly, they are splitting. No one really knows the reason, and she starts demanding money, goes to Hawaii without him, and with a friend instead. More shady behavior. Sadly, he was struggling with depression, and when he found out that his wife, of barely even a year might I add, was cheating on him with her close guy friend, and using his/their money to fund trips with the guy, he killed himself. Now, he was a great guy, but he's from humble beginnings. That side of my family is a little trashy. Just enough to keep it interesting, right? So the funeral is underway. Everyone in the family is cursing the wife, so understandably blindsided and hurt at his passing. Then the wife walks in with her side guy, marches up to the family standing at the procession, and tries to blend right in with her side guy standing next to her. The gall on this woman. Instantly a fight breaks out, and my relatives, and screaming at her to get out of there. She's bawling and saying how much she misses her dear husband, with her side guy standing next to her in the funeral procession line, and my mom, who was in attendance, literally begins looking for the exit, because she thinks someone's going to pull a gun. His dad finally absolutely bellows above everyone else, shut the fuck up. My son is dead. And that kinda snaps everyone to their senses and they stop shouting. The wife/side guy leave quickly after that, but not before questioning my aunt/cousin's mom about who's getting the house that they own together. Shit was wild. Sadly, my time to shine. A close friend of mine, 32-year-old guy, unexpectedly passed away due to a freak accident. Just to give you an idea of how to picture this story, the priest sounds like the Count from Sesame Street. At the wake, he forgot my friend's siblings' names a few times and gave a very short speech, and, despite knowing the family for a long time, didn't seem to have any recollection of who they were. Fast forward to the end of the funeral. Several family members had given beautiful and heartfelt eulogies. Friends read literary and biblical passages and sang songs. It's time for the priest to wrap things up and send everyone to the cemetery, and he rambles for a minute or two before abruptly saying, and now, long pause, I must, how you say, switch gears, because I have a wedding this afternoon. Even longer pause, while he moves his hands up and down looking quite confused, and finally brings them together, while he points to my friend's parents, and says I'm sorry. Sounded like some sort of Transylvanian Ron Burgundy. Everyone was in shock, but at least my friends and I can joke about how hilarious our deceased friend would have found it all. My sister's. She was murdered last April. Her ex-husband did it. It was a case of domestic violence and severe abuse. It was seriously horrific, and my mom and I had to fly across the country with her kids for the funeral. At the wake, her grandmother, my sister was half related to me through our mom, came up to me and said, I'm so glad you could make it. I know you didn't love her. And here I'm like, what the fuck? I'm bawling my eyes out with her kids, and this struck me like a slap in my face. I said, what the hell are you talking about? Of course I love her. Her grandma, well, if you loved her you would have been here in Florida, not in Las Vegas. Then she would be alive. You would have protected her. Needless to say, I just stood there in shock. But the next day at the actual funeral, after a long night of fuming, I cornered her and told her she was a piece of shit for saying that to me. My sister's whole family was in agreement about it. Never blame someone for a death. I was seriously emotionally faked up, and I'm still not over it. Her grandma was always a judgmental piece of shit, but this was beyond okay. Turns out she was baiting me into losing my mind so she could try getting custody of the kids. Did not work. Kids are happily living with me, my mom and my husband. We haven't heard from her since. My best friend in high school had a cousin pass from a freak accident. He was a tall guy and could dunk at 16. His finger caught in the net, then detached from his body under his full falling weight. He fell directly on the back of his skull. Lived in a coma for a few days, I believe. At the funeral, the family's pastor took the time to lecture a rather large crowd of mostly students from his high school on the evils of sports, underage sex and drugs. Real hell and brimfire damnation stuff. My friend was looking around at everyone like, is someone going to do something? Finally he got up, grabbed the 70-year-old pastor by the collar, and shoved him off stage. To pretty thunderous applause from mostly the students. That's not the inappropriate part though. That came afterwards when his parents lost their shit and told him how wrong and evil his actions were. His parents were some extreme evangelical Christian sect. Speaking in tongues, I don't know, seemed strange to me anyhow. A few years later he was disowned by his parents for getting his girlfriend pregnant. His girlfriend became his wife. They have 3 kids together and have been married north of 25 years to my best memory. His mom died alone in a pay-by-the-week motel after everyone including her husband finally got sick of her toxicity. Kyle never spoke to her after the day he was disowned. Always reminds me that negative people don't better your life in any way. Just cut them out like cancer. At my fiance's dad's funeral, he was an abusive piece of shit, so his suicide was more like a ding dong the witch is dead kind of moment for us. Here's your obligatory sorry for the long story. TLDR at the end. This pose was a massive gun nut, only voted what the NRA told him to, so you can imagine the kind of super redneck that he is. He lived in a trailer on the floodplains on the outskirts of a big city in the desert. Like, at the end of a dirt road off a rundown road off the highway, kind of middle of nowhere. Super middle of nowhere redneck country, with neighbors that own horses and stuff like that. A real Larry the Cable Guy type. Same generic visual too. Now at the point in time he killed himself, his girlfriend at the time was trying to leave him. She found out that he was abusive and cheats, and that his house beaches therefore financial support, housekeeping, and a wet hole for when he strikes out with the waitress at Hooters, or whatever. This was one of the reasons my fiance's mom left him. And those two had talked for a little bit when fiance's little bro was still back and forth in parental custody, and she had started expressing an interest in leaving him. So, the official story the woman had told the cops is that she was there to get the last of her stuff and officially end their relationship. She had been living in an apartment for a while by then, maybe about 3 months or so. And when she told him she was leaving him, he grabbed the gun, said I love you, and then shot himself in the head, right in front of her. Now, some other interesting details to add here. She had parked her truck a mile away and left her phone in it. I don't know about you, but if I was going to go end my relationship with a dependent abusive gun nut, I'd definitely leave my phone and my vehicle a mile away, because that totally sounds like a super smart thing to do. Anyways, she went to the neighbor's place right after, still covered in blood splatter and sheets so the cops could be notified, etc. So, now it's time to plan the funeral. As a family, everyone agrees to leave the planning to my fiance's little bro, who was devastated by the events. He had actually cared for the man, part Stockholm Syndrome, part being the favorite of the two boys, being rewarded for the sole purpose of not rewarding my fiance. Anyways, he was too traumatized by all of it, and partly felt at fault for it. He had moved out recently, because his dad had been demanding his whole paycheck as rent, and giving him like $40 every week, which is definitely not sustainable for an adult. So lil bro relied on the lady to help with funeral plans, and she kind of just took the reins and ran with it. She demanded an open casket for him. He died from a bullet through the temple, and this beach wanted an open casket. So she got her faking open casket. But nobody could really afford to pay a lot for it, so they went with the cheapest option. Day of the funeral arrives. It's at a Mormon church. He was Mormon in title, because his mom was a practicing Mormon, and fiance and I get there and it's, like, warm. Inside the church. Like, none of the men in suits are wearing their jackets and people are fanning themselves with the programs and all the doors are open. There's a room behind the main room, where the casket is, for the viewing. The room is a little rowdy. We get there, and fiance's mom has been waiting for us, so we could go in together. We get in the room and immediately we are hit with a smell. Pretty sure he wasn't embalmed properly, likely since they were just going to cremate him afterwards. We got closer and this bitch is folded over his stinky body, and this bitch is just wailing. Talking about how they were going to get married. She even had him in a faking wedding ring, and she was wearing one also. Another important thing she was wearing, a faking black veil. Like, 1950s little black hat with a face-sized piece of black lace hanging from it. I didn't kill my third rich husband in a row faking veil. We later find out that her previous husband had also died under mysterious circumstances. So she was there, making a fool of herself over his stinky body, while his other girlfriends learn that they weren't the only ones dating him. We finally get close enough to the body for my fiance and Mill to say their goodbyes, and not only can you clearly see where the putty in the bullet hole is, because it didn't match his smoker gray skin, but you could also see the faking fingerprint in the putty swirl. Super gross. Then during the service one of his buddies says how much he would have loved to just have his ashes put into coffee cans and used as a target at the shooting range, which he genuinely would, and Black Widow Beach makes a show about being offended and pretend faints in the front row. And then there was a flag ceremony performed by Pose's veteran friends, because they had bought all his lies about being in Desert Storm. They had done it because the military refused to send people to do it. That's likely because he was in basic for the whatever 3 months or so, and was such an insufferable douche. When he had gotten injured or something from his own actions they had told him to leave, or next dishonorably discharged. Douche never even finished basic. Also one of the pallbearers that carried the casket to the hearse after the ceremony was wearing a tail. Like, the kind furries use when they don't wanna commit to the fursuit tail. A kid in his late teens/early 20s thought that appropriate funeral attire was a suit with a furry tail. As a pallbearer. Anyways TLDR to this bitch who might have killed my fiance's post at and told the cops she was there to leave him was sobbing about how they were going to get married over his stinky poorly embalmed body during an open casket viewing when he died from a gunshot to the head, complete with 1950s black veil, and also the pallbearer had a furry tail. At my grandmother's wake, when I was in 6th grade, I was sitting with my big sister and my aunt Norma. Norma was a righteous lady, always ready for a martini, a cigarette, or to share her opinion. She was technically not my aunt, but my uncle's ex-wife, but was still a much-loved family member. At that moment, a tall, overcoiffed, rather unfortunate-looking woman walked into the doorway of the room we occupied, in a floor-length white sequined gown which, needless to say, was out of place. It turned out, she was the first to arrive from a group of Eastern Stars, a ladies group related to the Masons, expecting to sing a hymn, but who my mom had already asked to not attend, per grandma's wishes. Obviously, they ignored our wishes, as here she was. Everyone in the room gaped at the interloper, sequins shining, and my aunt Norma leaned over to my sister and I and said, just a little too loudly, "Who the hell is this bitch? I'll take care of this," and got up, had some words with the lady, and escorted her out, so my mom wouldn't have to. Her words left a huge impression on my tween self. Sometimes you just need to call someone out and ask them to leave, even if it does make a scene. This is gonna make me sound like a terrible person. At my grandma's funeral 2 years ago I was a pallbearer along with a few of my cousins. Well, one of the cousins was practically raised by her who is a goofball, but he has a good heart, and we just so happened to be directly across from each other while carrying the casket. We get to the steps of the church, and as soon as we get enough angle all of a sudden there was a rolling sound followed by a thump inside the casket. My cousin goes, "Damn, avocado." I replied with a what? And he explained that she loved her avocado tree, so he stuck one inside at her open casket viewing the previous day. So there were about 7 or 8 steps and the whole time each of us moved the avocado rolled and then bumped. On one of the steps he commented that she was alive, and I couldn't help but laugh. So we finally enter the church and everyone's looking at her casket and by proxy us, and here I'm cracking up. For the record, I loved my grandma and she would have thought it was funny, while simultaneously yelling at my cousin. I'd like to share my story, even though this has been up for a bit. When my grandpa died, our redneck, Okie family came out to Southern California for the funeral. My grandpa wanted to be cremated and buried at sea, so to speak, as he was in the Navy. My uncle didn't take my grandpa's passing well and had pre-gamed it pretty hard before we headed to the harbor. My brother and I were put in charge of driving him there. We were looking for parking near our dock when we had to wait for a few minutes for another car that was waiting for a spot. My uncle had been pretty belligerent about everything up to that point. I'm not buckling my seatbelt. Seatbelt laws are stupid and infringe on my rights. Why is your car beeping so much? Fine. I'll buckle up if it shuts your stupid car up. And he didn't want to wait for the couple in the car ahead of us. So he got out of the car and slammed on their windows and screamed at them to move the fuck on. You're blocking the road, idiots. Awesome. We found a spot and then were waiting at the dock for everyone to arrive. Most everyone was there. My parents, my siblings, my uncle and his girlfriend, my meth head cousin, assorted friends, and the minister and his wife. Suddenly, the guy that my uncle yelled at appeared in the midst of our group and started getting up in my uncle's face. Now, my uncle is a big guy, 6 foot, 250 lbs, Vietnam vet. He unfortunately suffers from pretty significant PTSD and the last thing you want to do is surprise him. We all thought the worst was about to happen, but my uncle didn't even get to utter a word because in came my stupid cousin. She's about 5 feet tall and about 5 feet wide. She has triple G cup breasts. They're huge and she suddenly began using them as battering rams on this dude. She was screaming, hiss, bounce, dad, bounce, just, bounce, died, bounce. She did this 3 times before anyone could recover enough to stop her. It was crazy. TLDR, my cousin assaulted a stranger with her boobs at my grandpa's funeral. My great grandmother died when I was 10. That was an age where I started getting in constant conflicts with my mother about my clothing. That year for school pictures, she insisted I wear a purple velvet skirt suit that had a high collar complete with brooch. It was a nice enough suit for a woman, but not appropriate for a 10-year-old girl. I got into a huge fight with her about the suit and of course ended up having to wear it anyhow. A few months after the school picture incident, my great grandmother passed. On the night of great grandma's wake, I anxiously asked my mother what she wanted me to wear, fully expecting her to tell me to wear the purple suit. To my surprise, she told me to wear what I wanted, as long as it was nice. I happily complied. We got to the wake and I went to the casket to sadly say goodbye to great grandma. When I got to the casket, much to my horror, I saw great grandma laid out in my purple suit. Stunned, I exclaimed to my mother, she's in my school picture outfit. My mother shrugged, why do you care? You told me you hated that suit. My father's funeral. My mother wanted to see the casket go into the ground. So they have it all set up, vault above ground. They are going to put the casket in the vault, put the lid on, then lower the vault into the ground. Funeral happens, we go to the cemetery, put the casket in the vault. Everyone but me, my mother, brother, the funeral director and the backhoe guys head out for funeral sandwiches. They hook the bucket to the vault lid, bigger slab of concrete, and lower it into place. But it goes on crooked and doesn't seat right. Before they can pick it back up and readjust it correctly, the funeral director and just starts kicking the lid as hard as he could. Everyone just standing there open-jawed as this overweight, middle-aged funeral director runs himself out of breath kicking this 1,000-pound slab of concrete and failing to budge it an inch. Once he winded himself and had to take a breather, the backhoe guy gave the controls a twist and it slipped into place. Luckily it was so weird we had a good laugh about it later, but that's something I'll never forget. My high school best friend, call her Sabrina, was absolutely spoiled rotten by her father. They were both insane, and he was crazy rich. I got to do a lot of fun things and go to awesome places in high school on his money and generosity. He was a funny nice guy, but they were weirdly close, and she's a demon when angry just like him. They were from a small town where their last name was essentially royalty. A few weeks ago I was anonymously sent a video of Sabrina having sex with my most recent ex who I lived with. I was upstairs in the bed asleep while this took place. This was the second time she had slept with a boyfriend of mine since we started college, so I decided to leave her entitled rotten as in the past. The morning after I saw the video, Daddy Dearest passed away. Suspicious circumstances, presumably overdose or suicide. I decided to go to the visitation despite my dislike for Sabrina, because her family had been a big part of my life years ago. It seemed the polite and respectful thing to do. Drive 5 hours and go in. Sabrina is on the floor in front of the casket. Beyond wasted, no bra with a very loose dress on and no shoes, smoking a cigarette in the funeral home despite the numerous warnings she's receiving from funeral home staff. She's screaming vulgar things at her dead father and rolling around mid-tantrum. Every time someone enters the room, she screams at them the precise reasons that her father hated them. To her stepmother, who is a very kind-hearted nurse who has shown nothing but love and understanding for Sabrina's downright evil as, "Why are you still here, Beach? Everybody knew you just married him for his money and now you have it." To her father's adopted mom who raised him, "Get the fuck out, you're not even related." To his business partner, "He was going to buy you out next week, consider yourself lucky." She sees me and screams bloody murder. "You faking Beach. He hated you, and I hate you more. Don't try to lend an ear, just because your dad is dead. He never loved you like mine loved me." Then vomits all over the open casket. I got the fuck out of there, and I'm still trying to processing what I saw. I could not even make that sheet up if I tried. Nobody's heard from her since the burial. My husband's funeral. Long story short, I was not on speaking terms with his family when he passed. His mother took advantage of his state of mind before he passed and had him change his will. He was 27 years old with stage 4 brain cancer, to exclude me from anything and everything once he passed. I was banned from the family visit prior to the funeral. None of his family spoke to me at the funeral, and I was not allowed to stand in the receiving line. We were married for 5 years, and together for 10. It was the saddest day of my life. His mother manipulated him during a horrific time in his life and turned the funeral we had planned together into a faking show. I know he would have been mortified. It was everything he didn't want. The funeral director took me aside and allowed me to be alone with my husband before they took him to the cemetery, and I'm beyond thankful for his kindness during such a sad, low and scary time in my life. If I was working as a base honor guard member at Tinker AFB, I performed a crapload of funerals, but one story sticks out the most to me. One time we got a funeral with a strange request: no Asians in the funeral honor guard. Because of the manning issues and the way we were tasked with these funerals, we had an Asian member on our team. We got there with no issues. Funeral director was cool with us and everything. The funeral began, and we folded the flag and the presenter the flag, the most experienced member who happened to be Asian, got on his knee and began reciting the statement for the next of kin. While he was reciting, the next of kin's family started whispering to him, "You stupid slit-eyed fuck," and other terrible things. While this was happening, he kept all his bearing and ignored what they said. He got up and saluted the flag and marched ceremoniously away from the family. They later came to me, a white dude, and asked for the shells of the bullets we fired for memories of their loved ones. I told them we leave the shell casings on the ground where we shot. This isn't true, because we clean him up later. We immediately got in the gov and watched as this family searched the ground for shells that didn't exist. We drove off, and that was that. I'm probably way too late, but here's my story. At a cousin's baby's funeral, she was pregnant and there were complications about a week before her due date that caused her to lose her daughter. It was a stillbirth. Most of my family is Mormon. There's a lot of us. My particular line came from a great-great-grandparent who had 13 children, and that great-great-grandparent herself had 10 siblings. Yes, we wear name tags at family reunions. That being said, because we are technically family, a ton of people get invited to funerals of people they don't know and are only distantly related to. At this particular funeral, another woman was offended by the mother, somehow. No one ever knew why, and decided to be as offensive as possible. The family released a flock of doves in honor of the innocent life taken too soon. Crazy lady brought a freaking shotgun and shot at the flock of doves when they were released, terrifying the living shit out of everyone there. No one knew what was going on. Some thought we were being shot at, including myself. Most of us hightailed it out of there. I didn't figure out what actually happened till later in the evening. It was the most insane thing I've ever witnessed. to this day. A couple years ago, a friend of mine committed suicide at way too young an age. He had had a falling out with his mom after she had run off with his dad's best friend, and that coupled with a growing drug problem pushed him over the edge. His funeral was one of the saddest things I've ever experienced. It was a shock to everyone involved, except apparently his grandmother. While his mom was grieving and being cared for by her new husband and family at the viewing, the paternal grandmother came out of a separate side room to say one last goodbye and leave through the main exit. There was no hidden animosity between them. You could feel the tension when you saw the look on her grandmother's face. She said her goodbyes, whispered a little prayer, and started walking out. As soon as she passed by his mom, she stops, turns and says, "What are you crying for? You're the reason this happened to him. Now you want to feel bad and pretend you cared? My grandson is dead because of you and only you." Needless to say, all hell broke loose, and she was escorted out pretty quickly. My great uncle died when I was 8, and I was heartbroken. He was a second grandfather to me. He had been married 3 times. He had children with both his first and second wife, and married my grandmother's sister later in life. The reason I mention this is because his children from his first marriage were solely about money, and Uncle Frank wasn't rich, but he did have enough to live a pretty great life and give my great aunt a comfortable life once he was gone. His son from his second marriage was at the funeral simply because he loved his dad. Now let me tell you a bit more about Uncle Frank, and you'll understand why this is so faked up. Uncle Frank was a great man. He gave to charities, helped anyone in the family financially when they needed, and never expected anything in return. And anytime he saw a stray animal, he did everything in his power to find them a home, if he didn't keep them himself. His son from marriage #2 was a lot like him, but just wasn't as well off financially. Son and daughter from marriage #1 were money hungry, as was their mother, who made off with a good chunk of money and land from Uncle Frank, otherwise he probably would have been downright filthy rich, and ex-wife #1 filled her kids' heads with lies about how much money and material things he had. Uncle Frank was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and they told him he was diagnosed too late for them to be able to do anything but make him comfortable. As soon as his son from his second marriage heard about this, he and his wife flew from across the country to come spend time and help take care of Uncle Frank. They were very kind and fit right into our side of the family. However, as soon as wife #1's kids heard he was dying, they waltzed into his home while he was laying in his death, demanding money, keys to all these different cars he supposedly had, and keys to a mansion he supposedly had. The only reason Uncle Frank had so much money was because he didn't buy any of those things. He lived in a large, but basically normal house, and had only 2 cars, one for him which was his truck, that was nearly 25 years old, and he loved dearly, and a Lincoln Continental, that he bought for my great aunt as a wedding gift, because it was her dream car. Uncle Frank cursed them out, told them they were no longer his children and to go home. They disappeared after that, and we all assumed they had left. Then comes the day of the funeral. My aunts, uncles, cousins, sisters and I were all sad sobbing before anything even started. Son from marriage #1 came stomping into the funeral to confront son from marriage #2 about stealing his inheritance. A fist fight ensued. The cops were called. Son #1 was arrested for assault. Needless to say, Uncle Frank left enough for my great aunt to live a comfortable life, and son #2 got everything else. Myself, in high school, there was this girl from my choir class I remember being rude/standoffish within class. During my junior year, she died of leukemia. Since she was a choir kid, the class was naturally asked to perform at her funeral. As for me, her mother asked me to sing this ridiculously dramatic Josh Groban song "Remember" as a solo at her service. It had to be rearranged for my voice type, soprano, and rehearsed quite a bit. I thought I was prepared on the day of, but the guilt of how cold and beachy I was to her when I knew her alive got to me that morning. She wasn't more than a little socially awkward. I knew she didn't deserve to be treated that way. Suddenly, taking part in this ceremony made her death more real than ever. Because of this, I wept my way through that solo, choking between the words, all technique and work done in rehearsal out the window. I remember causing people to either outwardly sob, like the blubbering was infectious, or to look around at the odd situation unfolding. To this day, it feels selfish and gross, not because crying at a funeral is a bad thing, but for making a scene at the funeral of a girl who didn't even see me as a friend. They took pictures of the deceased in their open casket, then a family photo around the open casket. They also did this for another relative at the viewing. It remains the absolute freakiest thing I've ever seen at a funeral. However, I did find out what it was about, and I'm trying so hard to be okay with it. The deceased in both cases were my husband's grandparents, and they are Greek Orthodox. Apparently, this is to send back to their remaining relatives back in the old country, and is expected. My husband and I both found it horrifying. It either never happened at funerals he went to before I came along, or he never noticed, but no one else batted an eye. Meanwhile, I was raised Catholic, and even having an open casket, much less a viewing, was a real shock to me. Can't stand it. It's a body, and you have to kiss it, and it's cold. Also, the first I attended was 5 days after the death. The remains had not held up well. My second story was shared with me via my stepsister. Step-grandma died and their entire family attended the wake. My stepdad has been estranged from much of his family, mostly due to my mother coming between them. Stepdad took that sad family reunion as an opportunity to air his grievances. He first bullied stepsister's Jean, stepdad's grandson, out of being a palbra. Mind you, none of his brothers were palbras, and it was mostly friends of the family / people's husbands doing it, but he basically pulled rank on his grandson, rather than asking one of the non-related men to step aside. Then, stepdad started a fight with his younger sister, who was stuck with planning the funeral, because he didn't like some of the details. To justify his argument, he randomly brought up protecting her when their drunk dad tried to beat them as kids. Stepdad is in his 60s now. Stepdad's older sister tried to intervene to calm him down, and he yelled at her, "You didn't even send my wife a card when her mother died." He and his older sister hadn't spoken in years, so it came as an odd surprise that he would expect this of her. After this very loud and awkward argument, stepdad shouted, "Well, I can see we aren't wanted here, so we'll take our flowers and leave." He turned on his heel, stomped over to the casket, snatched the floral arrangement he had sent to the funeral home, and left with my mother. My aunt's mother's funeral. She's an in-law. Some of my extended family took the front seats reserved for her and her immediate family while they were busy greeting guests. The seat usurpers were not directly related to the deceased, but sat there because they didn't want to sit in the back, which is where my cousins wound up having to sit for their own grandmother's funeral and my aunt for her own mother. Bonus, my grandma spending the entirety of her husband's wake, and apparently the night before, berating my mother for everything from the napkins she brought her to a promotion she had to turn down, while half the relatives tried to distract her from badgering my mother and the other half joined in. Bonus, one of my adult cousins, a seat usurper in fact, didn't come to my grandfather's funeral because he didn't feel like waking up early. Pre-funeral bonus, one of my uncles at Christmas loudly complaining to his table that everything in his life is terrible, and he's always been unlucky. His table group included another dying uncle, who was yellow from liver failure. Dying uncle actually listened to, and jovially soothed Winnie uncle, while his wife and sister held back angry tears. He was dead within the month. Winnie uncle continues to whine about his shitty life. My own son's funeral, when he was 8 months old in 1983. He died in his sleep in his mother's arms from encephalitis. My beach of a mother-in-law decided where the funeral was going to be and who was going to officiate it, and I was just trying to hold my wife together. It was our first and only child. I was 21 and she was 19. I really didn't want anything to do with the funeral having anything to do with religion, as I'm an avowed atheist, and she was utterly agnostic, but you know, mothers-in-law. So, we are all sitting there, and I'm in the front row holding my wife with a little tiny casket up on the dais, and my wife is bawling on my shoulder, and the asshole in the clerical collar, who has obviously thought long and hard about this for effect, started the ceremony with "As I lay me down to sleep." I never wanted to punch somebody more in my life that I didn't actually punch, and my wife and I sat there and listened to this asshole say the child's prayer about if I die before I wake, knowing that it would fuck me and my wife up and start the faking flood of tears. He died in her faking on arms in bed asleep. Anybody that's not a completely self-absorbed, insensitive, sadistic asshole would have chosen something else to say, or at least asked us about it first. Fuck that guy. I haven't been to a funeral since. Because of that, and my father being aware of what happened made perfectly clear to the family shortly before he died at the age of 87 from chronic kidney disease. I've been sick a long time, and anybody that wanted to come talk to me or say goodbye has. Don't you dare have a funeral, cremate me, and a month later have a faking party and invite everybody that I liked and have an impromptu very post-mortem wake. My mom has decided to do the same thing. She is now 87 years old but perfectly healthy. My experience at my son's funeral is the prime motivator for this, according to both of them. Fuck that minister slash fraud slash sadist. I hope he rots in his own special hell that he believes in, or loses somebody close to him with somebody else thinking they're being cute, ripping his faking heart out shortly after. During my cousin's eulogy, the Baptist minister delivering the eulogy decided it would be a good time to go all brimstone and fiery hell about committing adultery. Sinners repent, yada yada. My cousin was pagan and lived with his girlfriend, but his mom insisted that he have a Christian funeral because the rest of the family is fairly conservative. When the preacher got rolling, my cousin's brother stormed out. I followed him because he'd been drinking and I was concerned he'd do something stupid. Meanwhile, my soul noticed that my uncle, who was sitting in front of her and also drunk, started getting antsy. She leaned forward and whispered in his ear that if he wanted to say something, he should. So he stood up and said something to the effect of, "With all due respect, if you don't shut up, I'm going to deck you." Same uncle tried to get into a fist fight twice with his son at my house after my daughter's funeral, and we didn't speak again until he was dying. My father's funeral, 3 years ago. My father was an amazing man. People still tell me to this day how nice and genuine he was. He had 4 children, 2 from a previous marriage, then me and my sister. The 2 from the previous marriage are, in my opinion, evil incarnate. I would not believe they were my father's children if not for the resemblance. Back to the juicy part of the story. My dad passed after a 10-year battle with multiple sicknesses. His funeral was supposed to start at 10 AM, if I remember right. I don't know, the say was a blur. My sister was very attached to him, so she went in early just to be with him. She kneeled in front of the casket, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw the other 2 siblings walk in with their children. And they stood behind her and snickered at her, making comments like "AWW, poor little girl lost her daddy." When she told me that, my blood boiled, and I quite literally wanted to erase them from existence. But my father taught me better, their karma will come. My best friend's sister died, and I went to her funeral to support him. His girlfriend showed up mid-funeral, faked up on who knows what. Her doc was meth. She caused a big scene when entering, and went and sat in the front row. None of my friend's family liked this girl, but let it slide, because why cause unnecessary problems? After the funeral, but before heading to the burial, I gave my best friend a hug. I'm a female and his GF didn't like that, so she pulled him away and dragged him to his dad's truck and told him not to talk to me. At the funeral dinner, she wouldn't let him come around his friends and ended up convincing him to leave early to go use. I talked to his mom for quite a bit, since my family had been in her family's shoes. I'm late as hell, but here goes. I have 2 uncles on my father's side. One of my uncles, K, had lost his wife to a pretty rough battle with cancer. So K, my father, my other uncle R, myself and my girlfriend are all sitting first row keeping K's spirits up. We're an incredibly crude bunch and live gallows humor. We are rubbing K about some of the crazy moments my aunt did in her drunkenness or her antics. K and his wife had an awesome relationship, but his in-laws faking hated him. We're doing this at an ear whisper, while people are finally settling into their seats and the music is playing. Fast forward about 5 minutes of ripping on K. Quick note, Uncle R finally got a motorcycle after 40 years of K and my dad bugging him to ride. Broke his wrist and arm and dislocated his shoulder about an hour after driving off the lot on his brand new Holly. This happened about a week before my aunt's death. K is feeling facky and looking for some payback and decides to say to R, wearing a plain white cast on his arm, something to the effect of, "I can't believe you dumped your faking bike. You need a trike." Seen in a biker family as the ultimate insult. You could have at least chosen an black cast too. You heartless prick. R decides to retaliate. Says at a pretty high volume as the music is stopping, "Well, you could have hired a decent mortician because your plastic wife has the Macupan facial expression of that blow up doll we got you for your bachelor's party." The priest is just walking up to the altar. My extremely proper girlfriend and the deceased wife's family look utterly shocked as the place goes silent. The uncles, my father and myself just erupt with laughter, slapping our knees, and K is trying over his laughter to sound like he's upset but just can't. The funeral was slightly delayed until we regained some composure. Frequently we laughed as quietly as we can. He's my favorite uncle, and even though all of us sort of have a rough relationship, we all love each other. When he started to collapse as his wife was being lowered, the three of us immediately rushed to him to keep him strong. Later on that day, K and R just kept breaking out in laughter. Sure, it was incredibly inappropriate for guests, but to us and his deceased wife, it was very normal and she'd have loved it. Bonus story for context, K ended up having a brain aneurysm a few years later. My dad told me he wasn't doing well, then told me the truth on how it happened and made me promise not to say anything. It happened mid-orgasm with his newer girlfriend. Naturally, I did the right thing. I called his cell phone and left a voicemail that said, "Holy shit, K, your ego got so big and inflated your head so much that even your brain said fuck this guy and attempted suicide. If you die, I get your bike. And if you can't recover, I'll turn it into a trike for you, ya faking fogey." This was apparently so damn funny to him, he played it for everyone who ever entered his hospital room. The doctors had to tell K not to play it because he'd laugh so hard it could risk his recovery. He plays it for people to this day. His bike is not a trike, and he's still working on getting back on it. Not exactly a funeral, but I was out walking my parents' dog in the English countryside, no leash, when I came across a group of people dressed sharply in black. I didn't immediately clock what they were doing out there, but the dog makes a beeline at full speed to them, steals one of their bags, and runs off with it. I eventually catch her and get the bag to return it, but I peek inside, and what do I find? An urn filled with their loved one's ashes that they wanted to scatter in peace. Needless to say, no amount of training prepared me for this situation, and I had absolutely no idea what to do, and pretty much assumed I would die of shame right there. But as I walked back over to the people, they were howling with laughter. Apparently the guy that died was a big dog person who walked his dogs regularly out there, so they all thought it was the funniest thing ever and fitting. Luckily the urn didn't spill, so my dog hadn't yet done them the actual favor of spreading the ashes for them, but I still die inside a little when I think about it. I was sitting with my dad and my uncles as my grandauntie had just died. I come from a Maori, indigenous to NZ, family, and our traditions carry out an open casket, of which the coffin is set in the middle of our merry, sort of cultural building where events are held on. It is also tradition that we sleep on the ground around the dead body with really sheet mattresses. Everything was going pretty normal, a few relatives had told stories, maybe a few jokes here and there. Then we had to go to sleep. I was little, and like many other younger children, I found it hard to sleep in a bed that wasn't mine, mainly because I just heard people snoring and farting the whole damn roof off. I went to go to the bathroom, which was by the body, which doesn't really bother me as we kiss their forehead at the beginning at the service. As I walk past the body, all I hear is like a cracking noise and what sounded like a struggled snore. I start giggling, but turn around, and to my surprise my grandauntie's body is sitting upwards with mouth and eyes wide open. I'm in so much I just scream, "Holy faking shit." Everybody wakes up and runs for the door. Turns out she wasn't a zombie. Some gas had just released in her body which caused her to sit up. Still a scary moment, man. This wasn't even the worst part, as it scared me so much I pissed and shit my pants. I have a second story, and I'm sure it will get buried. It's funny and sad and inappropriate all in one. My 56-year-old uncle died unexpectedly and my grandfather took it hard. He eventually starved himself to death, and that part is a little further down. Grandpa and grandma were a tad deaf. Anyhow, a bunch of us were by the water cooler when grandpa goes to use the bathroom. I'm fairly sure the funeral home put the water cooler there so people could have a good laugh. He's been in there a while and eventually you hear the door rattling, followed by "let me out." At this point we are all trying to get the bathroom door open. The funeral home is about 8 million years old. So after some trying, the funeral home director comes over and said we need to get this door fixed. She's yelling at my grandfather to step away from the door. He's screaming back what? It goes around and around until she just gave up and kicked the door down. He likely spent 15 minutes in the bathroom. We all go back to the viewing room. A room full of friends and family. My grandmother screamed, "Where the hell have you been? What took you so long?" and shot him a look that could kill. He screams back, "I was stuck in the crapper." Pure gold. I've never laughed so hard. The same funeral, a distant cousin was taking photos of the deceased uncle. I said, "What the fuck? I must be adopted." Didn't realize the same woman who kicked down the bathroom door was right behind me. She was the best funeral director I've ever met. She says, "Your family is so entertaining." We laughed and laughed. So fast forward about 5 months. Grandpa dies. Same funeral home. I'm by the water cooler and the funeral director comes up to me and says, "At least you know he won't get stuck in there today." Nearly peed myself. Cracks knuckles. When I was 9 or 10, my mom's friend Bobby died. Bobby was an unassuming older man who surrounded himself with interesting characters. Among those characters was an off-the-wall prostitute nicknamed Crazy Karen. Bobby died of a heart attack or something, and his funeral began as any other normal funeral. Everyone viewed the body, took their seats, and listened to the sermon. Suddenly, a few minutes after the sermon began, Crazy Karen stormed through the doors, drunk beyond belief, and howling loudly in grief. She walked in with an old school boombox, yelling, "Oh Bobby, no," and fell to her knees before his casket. My mom was a bit of a notorious bar brawler at the time, and a woman in the pew in front of us turned to her and said, "Please do something. She ruined my daughter's funeral, and I don't want her to do the same to Bobby's." Crazy Karen stood back up and said, "Bobby, I'm gonna give you one last dance, baby." Turned on the radio and started taking her shirt off in a sloppy striptease sort of way. My mom flew from her seat and said, "Alright Karen, let's go now." Crazy Karen socked my mom right in her jaw. My mom grabbed her by her hair and dragged her out of the sermon. They started fist fighting in the hallway between the viewing rooms. The pastor attempted to close the curtain and carry on with the sermon, but it wouldn't close all the way, and everyone was turned to try to see through the opening. Eventually the cops came and split them up. My mom managed to have Karen pinned to the floor with her shirt over her head by the time they arrived. They questioned everyone, and even the pastor was grateful for my mom and begged them to not to charge her with anything. Apparently Karen was a bit of a regular funeral crasher, and my mom was really just trying to keep the peace in a weird way. The cops were extremely familiar with Crazy Karen, and they ended up giving their thanks for keeping her detained at a time like this. The rest of the funeral went well and as normal. TLDR, drunk prostitute crashed my mom's friend's funeral with a loud striptease. Turned into a fist fight. When my maternal grandmother passed in 2008, I went to her funeral with my mom. I had only really met my grandma 2 or 3 times in my life, due to my mom having fallen out with her family before I was born, for various reasons I'm not going to go into. We had only recently reconnected with my mom's family the year previous, when her dad died, so for me, it was a real surreal thing being the only dry-eyed person there. I felt rather out of place, and still do whenever someone has a death in their family. What I didn't know at the time, a few members of my extended family were trying their best to introduce me to a man at the funeral, whom most of my cousins called uncle. I just assumed he was an uncle in the family. I was polite, and said hello, and had a small conversation with him, and thought nothing of it. After all, I'm just now meeting most of my extended family. It turned out that the man they were trying to get me to talk to all the time was actually my biological father. The TLDR version is the man who raised me. My dad was unable to produce sperm, so a friend of his offered to donate sperm so they could have a child. Why was my extended family pushing for me to find out at my grandma's funeral? Because they knew my mom and dad were in the process of divorce. What a better time than to tell a 15-year-old lass that the man who has raised you isn't your dad than at your grandmother, who you barely met, funeral. They were known in the family for being nosy about other people's business, and that was part of the reason my mom didn't stay around them. My mom and dad told me about the situation not long after the funeral. I was confused at first, but then something started to make sense, and I understood why they didn't tell me until I was older. I have no hard feelings about it at all. When I was 18, my BO dad reached out to me to see if we could meet properly and catch up. We have a decent relationship. We send cards at birthdays and Christmases. We catch up with each other on email. My mom sent him letters and photos yearly as I grew up, telling him what I had done that year and the such. He respects that I'm my own person, and I respect him in that way too. My grandma was one of the most generous and kind-hearted person I've ever met. Everyone in my family loved her, but one cousin in particular took advantage of her. Every holiday the family spent together, he complained about how his ex-wife spent all of his money and took the kids. In reality, she has left him because he was a pose father who spent all of his money on drugs and prostitutes. My cousin showed up to the funeral high with his new girlfriend. We were all trying to be friendly, but he wouldn't shut the fuck up and kept heading to the bathroom every 30 minutes while drinking heavily. During the service, he insisted on giving a speech and yelled, "Nobody gives a fuck what I think." After the service, I could barely keep it together and needed to be alone to cry for a moment. I grabbed a cigarette from a family member and walked around the side of the building. Saw him limp getting head from his girlfriend on top of the air conditioner, snorting something. Stood there staring for a moment in disbelief before just losing it. I pushed the girl off him, shoved him off the air conditioner. I just kept yelling, "What the fuck are you doing?" and shoving him to the ground every time he tried to stand up. His pants were around his ankles, and I was shoving him on pile of rocks. He got cut up pretty bad and bruised a few of his ribs. I could have handled it better, but I didn't. That was my worst experience. Oh boy, this post was made for me. TLDR at bottom. At my grandpa's funeral last year, my family had a full-blown fight before, during and after. It's still going on. It started while he was still in the hospital. He was in end-stage congestive heart failure, and there are a few of his kids that are extremely concerned with who gets what, so they showed up and just started staking claim and taking stuff from his house, from his faking underwear drawer, where he kept a bunch of his old Air Force badges and more important things. Before he was even out of the hospital, the man was fully aware the whole time. He even asked why people are taking his stuff. This was primarily one of my aunts. The rest of them had their moments, except for my uncle and his wife, but no one was as bad as this one aunt. So anyways, stuff is disappearing. My mom and uncle are livid over it. My uncle and his wife live with my grandparents to help care for them, and my grandma is entirely oblivious to it all and is super easy to manipulate. So the shitty aunt is just being really sweet to my grandma and talking her way out of the family home with half of my grandpa's things, like his Air Force ring and wedding band, were left to my uncle, only son, and she tried stealing them before my uncle's wife confronted her as she was leaving. This was all a major issue, right? But the boiling point was a faking truck. My mom bought my grandma this super nice truck several years ago and had it all customized and stuff for him. He loved that thing, kept it locked in a garage when it wasn't being driven, and washed it once a week. That thing was pristine after over a decade and had barely any miles on it. My aunt asked him if she could borrow it, then told my grandma that he told her in private that she could just have it. My mom was pissed because 1. Grandpa wasn't even in the ground yet, and 2. She was taking this vehicle my mom paid a crazy amount for and maintained for my grandpa just because she wanted it. Wasn't going to give my mom money for it, not the main concern. Wasn't going to pay my grandma anything for it, was the main concern. And to top it off, my grandpa actually left the truck to my mom to begin with. So that was the breaking point. My mom confronted my aunt, had this huge blow up, etc. So grandpa passes on Christmas Eve. Aunt with the truck didn't show up. She decided to spend the holiday with her husband's family because she really wanted to celebrate it in her new house, and we move forward with figuring out the funeral. The day of the funeral rolls around, and I show up to my aunt there with her 2 kids, her husband, stepdaughter and her stepdaughter's 2 kids. Never met the stepdaughter's kids before, and the stepdaughter hasn't been around for 15-ish years. Literally no one knows these people, and they are all talking insane shit. Like whispering and snickering amongst themselves, and I couldn't catch what was going on, but it was that vibe of shit is about to go down hard. Welp, I found out fast. My mom shows up, sobbing, and goes straight back to my grandma's room to do her hair. I follow, and she pulls me aside, and shows me a text from my aunt's youngest daughter, 15, that says, "You can pry that truck from my cold dead hands, you faking cunt. It's mine now," and a slew of other really over the top nasty messages, sent literally that day, the day of the funeral. So my mom is just a wreck, because her dad died, and now she's got some kid texting her some vile shit to top it off. So, I pulled my aunt outside away from everyone and said, "Look, I'm not trying to get in the middle, but this isn't okay. You don't need to do anything now, but make sure this doesn't continue, because no one needs this today." And genuinely, I was that calm. I was trying so hard to not hit her. I was literally tunnel visioned for just getting through the day as painlessly as possible. So my aunt loses her absolute shit, yells at me for attacking her kid, even though she was just defending her mom. I said, "No, that's not what I'm doing," and she just kept yelling at me that I need to know what's really going on. Frankly, I don't care. I told her I don't. I don't care who said what. All I know is that today is not the day for it. That's it. Settle your shit later. Out of the house. Feud for the next century. Just don't do it today. Her response was to go inside, march to the room my mom was in with my grandma, and start reading off the texts in front of both of them. I mean, hand on her hip, smug as fuck smile, super proud of herself. My grandma was sobbing. My mom is screaming at her. One of my cousins, not her kids, came rushing in to help me because I'm standing between them, and my aunt is literally pushing me and yelling at me to get the fuck out of her way because I refuse to let her all the way in the room. My uncle's wife came out and told the crazy aunt he needs to get his wife out of there, so he eventually shows up like a faking tired dog trainer and just does the psych come on. But wait, there's more. So during all of this, her kids are sitting inside talking about how people need to just get over it, how their aunt, my mom, and to give some context, my mom watched these kids non-stop for her sister and they used to show up at her door wanting to spend the day with her, so those texts and their commentary really hurt, needs to just deal with it. These are literally a 15 and 17 years old and the stepsister who's like 23, and I have no clue how she even has an opinion on it. So their comments get people even more upset, so they all go to leave, but surprise, it's a small yard, and they're blocked in by my mom. And my mom just turns and says nope, she's not moving until they hand my grandma money for the truck that they literally drove there in. So now people are outside full tilt screaming at each other because my aunt is trying to leave and my mom won't let them. Then the stepdaughter decides to, for some unknown reason, start screaming at my one level-headed cousin that she's a bitch, again, no clue why, and threatening to fight her. My normal cousin is just like, wait, what? My mom's boyfriend is inside yelling at my grandma now because she's yelling about how she just wants her kids to get along, and he's yelling at her that she needs to get kids in line and how my aunt is causing all of this. My uncle eventually went out and told my mom to move so my aunt could go and we could bury his dad. We get to the funeral, it's open casket. My aunt and her whole family keep themselves separate from the rest of us. We go in, and we are crying, saying our goodbyes, etc. I don't think I've ever cried so hard and wholly in my entire life. I mean entire body heaving crying. I loved my grandpa so much. I'm getting married in June, and he was supposed to walk me down the aisle. I cannot in any adequate wording express how devastated I was, and the waves of sadness that still hit. My aunt's two kids and stepdaughter were standing off to the side, drinking Starbucks frappes, and laughing amongst themselves. During the viewing, while I hugged my mom, my grandma, my uncle, his wife and everyone that wasn't being a dick, and my boyfriend supporting my entire frame, because I just felt like I couldn't even stand, and they're in the corner just enjoying themselves, and talking and laughing. I've never had such a visceral shift from sadness to absolute anger before. I'm here, feeling like a huge part of my life just disappeared, and I'm so filled with sadness and regret over the days I didn't take to get breakfast with him and all the stories that I don't remember the details for, and how I was supposed to make him sugar-free oatmeal cookies last Christmas and never did, and then 5 feet away people are just so unbothered, even though they should be sad too. Don't they care about how he recorded all the Saturday morning cartoons for them, so they could always watch them, not just on weekends? Or how he taught us how the real way to enjoy Cheerios is in a bowl of vanilla ice cream. Or how he would always get us to stick our tongues out in photos when we were all kids. It hurts so much to see them just not care, right there and then. Why couldn't they just stand outside? Why did it have to be right here and now? TLDR, my family had a full of fight the day of the funeral, but the worst was the frappuccino drinking relatives talking and gossiping in front of the open casket, while the rest of us had emotional breakdowns. I'm super late here, but couldn't pass it up, because this is something I witnessed, that I refer to as one of the most awkward things I've been in the presence of. My dad has a group of older gentlemen that he drinks coffee with every morning. A few years ago, one of his buddies' wife passed away. They decided to do a memorial service for their family and friends at the husband and wife's favorite sports bar that I attended with my dad. Everything was really nice and friends of the family were going around and telling sweet and funny stories about her. Towards the end of the service, the boyfriend of the deceased's daughter stands up. Thinking he was going to say something memorable about his girlfriend's mother, the room fell silent. He then gets down on one knee and spontaneously purposes to the daughter, in front of people she didn't know that well, and without a ring. She said yes and everyone clapped and congratulated them, but there was some awkwardness in the air, shared by just about everyone. I know this will get buried, but I've got to try. 2 stories, both 100% true and accurate. I'll summarize though cause I'm on my phone. 1. Grandpa died 10 years ago. My father, who Phil died, is yelling from the back of the synagogue, Jewish church for those uninformed, about how the ceremony after the service will not be performed street the agreed upon place, where there's already a damn hole in the ground, and yelling about how he wants to do it somewhere else. He's not a drinker, just an asshole. 2. When my great aunt died, my cousins from out of town came in from California. That's important to note for later. This story happened in Minnesota. In one large vehicle as most of the pallbearers, 4 out of 6. For whatever reason someone cut the procession in half, and we got stuck. Then someone had the brilliant idea to get some White Castle, because they didn't have it out west. So this car literally pulls into White Castle for a crave case. Those who know White Castle know that it's not quick at all. So by the one we get the food, the entire procession is gone, out of sight. This was before the age of cell phones and no one knew where to go. So we ended up 1.5 hours late for a funeral, of which everyone just stood around worried about us, as we drove around looking for random cemeteries that Saturday morning. Summary: got lost in funeral procession because of White Castle, and was hour and a half late to funeral. Burgers were legit though, so worth it. And I haven't witnessed many, but at a friend's father's funeral, this woman walked into the church with a big ass cup from Starbucks. Now, the closest Starbucks was fully 1.5 miles away from this church, so she sure as hell had time to finish whatever she was drinking, or, at the very least, had time to have enough of it, so she would even think, oh hey, I just bought this, and don't want to get it cold. No, she had plenty of time to think this one through. Anyway, the usher, an older guy, sees this and comes down the aisle toward her, and just takes it out of her hand, and takes it out front and I guess dumps it. She sort of stopped to protest, but to her credit, I think, realized what an idiot she had been. Edit: I see I'm in the minority here. Maybe as a Catholic, the notion of ingesting anything at all ahead of the Eucharist seems appalling to me. This was an Anglican church, so maybe this was okay. It just seemed so incongruous to me. Also, a drink look, if it were a flask, I'd have scooted up closer to her. Coffee seemed gratuitous. So it's my grandfather's funeral. Sudden, 3-month battle with cancer, and he lost. Sucked, real hard. The wake has passed, it's now the next day for the funeral. We're in the limo in front of the funeral home, waiting for the hearse to depart. We've been in the limo for about 5, maybe 10 minutes. There was a bit of a thing going on since my grandfather had passed. He had all of the house bills in his name, including the cell phone. Now she needed her cell phone. At the time it was her lifeline to quite a few names and contacts, and during such a trying time, having a phone wouldn't be a bad thing. So I'm in the limo with my mother, my grandmother, widow, my father, my aunts, and maybe a few others. I can't recall exactly, but we are all in there and waiting, and the cell phone discussion starts up. My aunt takes the phone and calls the carrier, couldn't tell you which, and the conversation goes something like this. Yes, I'm trying to get the service turned back on for this phone. It's been disconnected because the name on the bill has died. Murmuring in agreement, well, yay, it's my father, but this is his wife's line, the widow, and she needs her number. She's still paying the bill. More murmuring, do you want me to knock on the casket? I can walk to the casket right now. It was unbelievable, because at this point, this conversation had been going on for quite some time. I'm leaving a lot of the conversation out, but we are cracking the hell up and this was the last straw. Everyone in the limo is now laughing, and I mean, really hard. Even my grandmother, I think, was in tears. I'd never in my life expected to be sitting in probably one of the worst experiences of my life and laughing that hard. But I still can't understand what was so difficult about changing the bill to another owner. I mean, maybe since it was like the very early years of cell phone coverage, they didn't have all of their processes in place, and it was all very new. Maybe? It's not as inappropriate as other commenters' stories, but I was weirded out by it nonetheless. So I thought I'd share. For the funeral of my husband's grandfather, my husband's father hired a team of professional photographers. I know there are cultural backgrounds where you take photos with slash of the deceased. I come from one, but no one in my family does it anymore. But it still was weird. I didn't notice them during the service, only when the casket was carried to the grave. They ran in front of it, photographing the whole process. Also they wore black t-shirts with their company name in pink letters on it. Not really the right attire for a funeral in my opinion. I was weirded out by the whole thing, but didn't say anything, and wouldn't have complained about it if it would have been only that. At that point I had only been together with my husband for 2 months. I only came for his emotional support. I never knew his grandfather, and got to know his mother, stepfather, and brother only the day before, as we thought the funeral shouldn't be first time. My husband had been close to his grandfather and was devastated, so he didn't notice as much of the weird stuff in the moment. When I told him afterwards, he was appalled. After the casket was let down into the grave and everyone was coming up to say their last goodbyes, a woman went behind the grave, who was not one of the hired photographers, and took photos of everyone who came forward with her smartphone. She stood behind the grave the entire time, hunched over it, and holding the phone away from her to get a better picture. What made it even worse was the fact I knew her. Not from the family, but from television. She was the wife of a former sports celebrity, who already appeared on reality TV shows. Made it even more surreal. At the reception I saw her again, telling my husband's stepmother that she documented everything. They seemed to be best friends and the stepmother seemed grateful. I don't know if that's normal elsewhere, but that wasn't the first funeral I've attended, and I had never seen someone else do that before. Later down the road I learned that my husband's father and his wife are full-blown knocks, and there's not much that surprises me anymore.